All right, we're going to pick up where we left off in the middle of the PowerPoint, the evolution PowerPoint. And we talked last time about the foundations of the theory, evolutionary theory. And so I'm going to look a little bit more today into some of the patterns that we see in nature that help support the theory, that need explanation, and that are provided explanation by the theory of evolution by natural selection. A couple of the other things that take place when we look at this, there will be, a couple other influences on evolution that we need to mention that do play a major role. Natural selection is the primary mechanism, but natural selection only works once you have genes to evolve, and so the origin of life is a slightly different issue than actual evolution. And the other course I teach, the biogeochemistry course, we talk a little bit about that issue and the chemistry of the early Earth. I'm not going to go into that too much or at all really right now. I just wanted to mention that once there was RNA, which is a molecule similar to DNA, then selection can work because it's a molecule that can store information and replicate itself. Once you have that happening, all of these other effects can come into play. We'll start at the bottom with mutation, because most people think of this as sort of the keystone to evolution, and it is a major part, but it's a major part only at small intervals. It allows for some changes to take place that can then be selected for. Most mutations are negative. We spend most of our lives trying to avoid mutations because they lead to cancer. Mutations in the genes that are passed on to offspring, our gametes, generally lead to birth defects and are catastrophic in many cases. And so we've spent a lot of money trying to avoid these mutations and cure these mutations. Very rarely, but given billions of years of time, a mutation can confer an advantage. But it's not X-Men. Okay, we're not going to get superpowers all of a sudden because of a gene mutation. It might be something very slight. It's going to be something very slight because a single gene by itself doesn't really lead to any traits. It contributes to traits, and it might be enough to give us a better enzyme for a process in our cells that allows our cells to be more efficient, or in some other way give us an advantage. So mutations can be selected for, but they generally are negative. Now again, given millions of years, billions of years of time, these impacts can add up, and they can provide for opportunities at crucial times on occasion. And we could look at some of those patterns in not only the fossil record, but right now, in things that we have seen in our own genome, and things that we can, again, manipulate a little bit. So next week in lab, we'll talk a lot more about that. Now, I will need to talk about next week's lab at the end of this lecture, because since I will be gone on Tuesday, it'll be a different type of lab. We won't be meeting in person. But we'll talk about that at the end, because hopefully more people will be here by then. And I know that I've had a lot of people out in my other classes due to flu, so I'm not going to lay down the law today and do the quiz at the beginning, but hopefully I won't see the continuation of this attendance pattern and and they have to resort to that. So just, I don't know, throw that out there. These other three things on the list below natural selection are ways that the distribution of genes can be changed within populations or around the world. Once we have organisms that are particularly reproducing by sexual reproduction, not all organisms do, of course. Bacteria can simply bud off. There are other animals that can bud off individuals and certain plants and so forth, but most organisms undergo a sexual reproduction. And in that, we rearrange the genes within a gene pool. There is occasionally what's called genetic drift, where genes sort of accumulate in one part of a population relative to another. Certain genes. Now we're seeing this in our own human population a little bit, as we see slightly different genes in European versus Asian versus African populations, very slight differences, such as the ones that lead to myceliac disease. things like that. That's genetic drift. It's not as much, it's not really adaptation. There's nothing about it that is conferring an advantage necessarily, but it just sort of, within a large population, you're going to have some of this genetic drift. The other two have to do with extinction events. If you remember in our hopscotch through geologic time at the end of the Permian and at the end of the Cretaceous, we had two major extinction events. These produced what's called the bottleneck effect, meaning what species survived through that bottleneck of that mass extinction were the ones that could then become the founders of new diversity. The founder effect is the fact that whatever gets into an environment first, organismally sort of has an advantage. And this is sort of one of the better examples of this is why mammals and dinosaurs evolved at the same time, but dinosaurs dominated most of the niche space for millions of years. Mammals were around. We always think of mammals as being superior to reptiles. If we think of dinosaurs as reptiles, that may be a little off base. They're maybe as different from reptiles as mammals are from reptiles. Both dinosaurs and mammals evolved from stem reptiles. But we generally think of dinosaurs as more reptilian and therefore inferior to mammals. Well, they dominated mammals for millions of years. Most of that was due to this founder effect. Even a few thousand years advantage gave them a chance to fill the niche space before mammals did, and then they outcompeted mammals for those available resources. This was after the major extinction event. So the stem reptiles survived through the bottleneck of the end of the Permian extinction event, and then diversified in the early Mesozoic into mammals and dinosaurs and other reptiles. Dinosaurs got the foothold first, and through the founder effect dominated the planet for millions of years. So these are some of the patterns that we see when we look at evolution through time. We also see a lot of interesting patterns when we look at the present day from a historical perspective. Homologies, which are shown here, are similar features that have different underlying structures supporting them. A whale and a dolphin and a shark have fins. Whales and dolphins have the same bones in their fins that we have in our arms and legs. A shark does not. A shark does not have those bones. There are other fish, the lobe-finned fish, that have bones in their fins, and it's from those bones that these bones evolved. And we can also look at each of these different limbs here. A whale's fin, a frog's foot, horse's leg, lion, human, bat, bird. Those are all the same bones. They're the exact same bones adapted to different uses. So we can look at analogous traits between the bat and the bird, for instance, or the whale and the shark, and we can look at homologous traits where the same bones are used differently in very different limbs. The femur, the ulna and the radius, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, those are the same bones in all of these limbs. They've all been adapted for different uses. That's a pattern that we can see. And again, when we look at in lab this week, when we talk about our taxonomic hierarchies, we can definitely look for patterns like this to help us decide relationships, and the fact that all of the vertebrates have an ancestry in lobe-finned fish. It's very easy to trace that back in time. All of the sort of links are there. We can see these bones evolving from lobed fins into amphibian legs, and into reptilian legs, and so on, and then back to a whale's fin. That record is fairly complete. We also all have what are called vestigial traits. A whale's fin doesn't really require all of those phalanges to work, right? They're vestigial. We have wisdom teeth. Those are vestigial. We have an appendix, which we can do without. It does do a little bit, but it's easy to do without it. It's vestigial. Even our little toes, to an extent. Some of the more interesting ones that we have is the fact that the hair stands up on the back of our necks when we get afraid or angry. You can think of a lion, of course, that and any other animal that has a ruff that makes itself look bigger when it's threatened, and why we have the same reaction is an interesting vestigial trait. I hesitate a little bit, but I'd always like to bring up a little bit about how many of our behaviors may be vestigial in a modern sense. And I'll let that sort of simmer a little bit because I don't want to, again, speculate too much, but I have a feeling that a lot of our instinctual behaviors, such as xenophobia, are vestigial. They're not serving any good purpose anymore, even though they may have at some point in our evolutionary history. The other interesting pattern that we can look for today is when we go around the world and we look at fossils in the rocks. We already talked about this with plate tectonics. We know, for instance, that Africa and North America were connected because you find the same mountain chains on either continent, the same age, same rocks, same fossils. We know that they've now been separated by the Atlantic Ocean. But you can go back and trace that biogeography all over the planet, not only in a single time frame, but multiple time frames. And so we really can reconstruct not only where continents were, but how species, groups of animals, plants and animals that were once within a single region have become separated and then changed as they've been isolated from each other over time. And those patterns of change are in the fossil record, and we can see them very clearly. The fossil record is not perfect, but it's pretty good. And so a lot of times people will attack the fossil record as being an imperfect record, but as I mentioned, we have a pretty complete record of the transition from lobe-finned fish into amphibians and reptiles. We have a very complete record of the stem reptile evolution in the mammals. In dinosaurs, we have a very good record now of the whale evolution from a bear-like animal back into the oceans. Even our own history, this quote, missing link when I was growing up was the big rage. Where's the missing link? Well, we found 3 or 4 links in between a common ancestor with the apes and ourselves. We're always finding more. Particularly most recently, we're finding dinosaur fossils in China that have feathers and hair on them. So we're learning a lot more about dinosaur history, filling in some of those details. Birds are one of the hardest lineages to trace because bird bones don't fossilize as well as other bones, being hollow and fragile. So the exact origin of birds is still one of those things we're looking for. But we really do have a pretty good record in the fossil record. And that, combined with the patterns of biogeography and all of these other patterns that we see in bones and features, and now genes, now that we can sequence the genome not only of ourselves but of many of other animals and compare those patterns as well, it's a pretty good record. Or it's really a very good record. It takes maybe 20 years to really study it very well. It's the other misconception a lot about evolution is that it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy, pretty simple, right? And like any scientific theory, when you boil down to it, I mean, rocket science is pretty straightforward. It's a lot more straightforward than evolution. But I'm not a rocket scientist. It's beyond me how to get a rocket into space. It's just Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. You put enough force against the ground, it's going to push the rocket up into space. That's simpler than that. Well, then you've got a lot of resistance in the air that you have to push through, and there's eddies of currents and things that any small difference can put you off course. So it becomes very, very difficult, actually, in practice. And the same thing's true with studying all of this that I'm talking about here. I'm simplifying things, but it takes a lot of time to really see these patterns and study them with the scrutiny that's necessary to make all the connections that the theory gives us. I'd also like to point out a couple other things that are often misconceptions. There's no perfection in biology because we're always behind our optimal fitness. We're never perfectly fit. Not only do we have a number of vestigial traits, but we're limited by our evolutionary history. We only can adapt what features we have. This is why X-Men aren't going to happen, right? Things don't just pop up out of nowhere. Slow changes over existing features can evolve into new features. All right? The same limb or reptile arm evolved into our arm eventually, but also a horse's leg, right? So different uses can lead to different adaptations, but the bones are the same. The same historical available resources were used. Things don't just pop up out of nowhere. Our eyes are a good example of this kind of thing. One of the critics of evolution in the past looked at the eye in particular and how well it works together and how every piece has to fit together perfectly for a human eye to work. And so he said that it appears as if a watchmaker had to make the eye because it would have required being put together. And it couldn't have happened due to evolution, due to slow changes over time. Now it can, and we can go back in the fossil record and see all those intermediate stages. But it's also got a little bit of a hidden remnant of evolution that's interesting too, and that is the fact that our optic nerve actually has a bend in it. And we have a blind spot because of that. Our brain fills that blind spot in by what we expect to see, with what we expect to see. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about consciousness. But that bend is there because of how our eye has evolved and then moved in our skull, rotated to serve the purpose that it currently does throughout evolutionary time. Again, we can trace that. An octopus eye is a lot better than ours because it doesn't have that kink in it, in that blind spot. So there's those kinds of things that are interesting, again, when you look at patterns in our own bodies or in other organisms. If a trait does not help an organism survive, then it is not going to be selected for. But if a trait that was serving a purpose in the past is retained and it's not hurting you, it's not being selected against either. So that's one reason why we have vestigial traits. We actually have probably quite a few traits that were evolved for a certain purpose or no longer necessary, but they're not hurting us. Unless your appendix becomes infected, it's not hurting you, right? Unless your wisdom teeth become impacted, they're not really hurting you. So those kinds of things are maintained. I do want to mention chance. There's nothing random about evolution. Nothing random about evolution. But there are what you might consider chance events, like asteroids hitting the Earth, right? Evolution can't prepare for that. There's no preparing from generation to generation, the possibility somewhere in the future that an asteroid could strike the Earth and lead to a nuclear winter. So when that happens, organisms are vulnerable. And when the environment changes that dramatically, it changes the game completely. And that's why we have major extinction events at those types of occurrences. Volcanic eruptions, ocean current, changes in ocean currents. Any number of things that evolutionarily may happen by chance, only within certain odds, are still things that have to be adapted to by whatever organisms are around. And not all change is good over long periods of time. As I mentioned before with the dinosaurs, it was advantageous to get bigger for a long time, then all of a sudden it wasn't, right? It was better to be small when, again, we have a nuclear winter scenario and you have to survive on very limited resources. So there are different time frames in which evolution occurs, in which the conditions change, and there are some chance events, but nothing about the response to these events is random. It's very much determined by genes and these principles of natural selection. I'm putting up here a number of books about the subject. If you're interested in reading more, The Blind Watchmaker, The Selfish Gene, both written by Richard Dawkins. There's also, I think I may have shown The Panda's Thumb and others that were written by Stephen Jay Gould. Those would be the two people I would recommend the most. They had a lot of discussions, you might call them arguments actually, about this. What level of selection is most important? And it's an interesting conversation, an interesting discussion within science and even outside of science, because Richard Dawkins, who's a biologist, was arguing that gene selection is the most important level. If we watch evolution happening right now, today, in our own bodies, in our laboratories, in the environment, and I'll get to a few examples here in a minute, selection of a single gene can actually lead to the survival or death of an individual organism. If I had a bad gene that gave me cancer, I'm gone, right? I'm out of the population. That one gene selected against me. And likewise, if I had a gene that allowed me to avoid cancer or something like that, it would allow me to survive. And when we look at things in the here and now, I mean, right now, he's got a good argument. Most of the time we think of species selection. It wouldn't just be me dying that would doom our entire species, right? The entire species has to be eliminated for us to go extinct. Every one of us, every individual. So when we look back, particularly when we look back through the fossil record, that's what we look for. That's the level of resolution that we look for, species selection. And so Gould argued for that. Said it doesn't matter what genetic changes happen within stable periods of time, but if there's a big asteroid or some other major event, selection gets rid of anything that isn't able to survive, and what survives then are the species that have adaptations for that. So in the long term, it's species selection that matters, not gene selection. Whereas in the short term, we don't see species selection happen very often, over thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, but we do see gene selection happening quite a bit, leading to some changes. So there are interesting perspectives, and again, whether or not molecular evolution, which is a study of our genes right now and what's going on right now, versus phylogenetic evolution, which is a look at the pattern of evolution through history and how we got to this current diversity on the planet. Which of those two perspectives, they're both correct, how we reconcile the two has not been exactly worked out. Because we haven't been able to study gene selection through an extinction event. Maybe we are doing that now, because as we mentioned, perhaps we're in an extinction event. So if we keep studying it for a few more thousand years, maybe we'll understand it a lot better. All right, we'll see. All right. Another interesting topic that comes up when we talk about evolution, and that's sexual selection. Now, I don't want to make too much out of this. It's an interesting subject. How much it has to do with our own evolution or with evolution in general is debatable. But it's an obvious pattern that exists, particularly in birds, certain bird species. And that is that mate choice can have a big role to play in what traits are considered advantageous. And the example that's typically given is a peacock. You look at a peacock, a male peacock, right? And he's pretty ostentatious, big feathers, and he's saying, here I am, to any predator that might be out there looking for a meal. They're easy to see. They're showing themselves off. Come get me, haha, here I am. Right? What could be advantageous about that? How could that possibly have evolved? You want to offer?
Well, I mean, in that sense, it would be kind of like almost a protection of the young kind of thing, or family. If he's the one that draws the attention of the predator, then that gives his family or his offspring a chance to get away.
That's true. He's a decoy. Distract the predator away from the mother and the offspring, and that's true. Particularly if you watch cardinals, the male cardinal is bright red, the female is more drab, and the male cardinal does exactly that. It makes itself obvious and flies away from the nest to pull predators away. But there's also a lot of evidence that female peacocks, peahens, choose the flashiest males to mate with. And if you're not a very flashy peacock, you get left on the sidelines, right? The flashier you are, the more attractive you are to the females. Now, there's two reasons for that. One, what we just talked about, but the other one is it's a reflection of the health of the individual. This happens in lions too. A big, full black mane really indicates that the lion is healthier. It doesn't have parasites, it's getting the right minerals, the right nutrition, whereas a lion with a thinner, redder mane may have parasites or some other condition that makes him less able to protect the pride. And females select the healthier males, and the symbols of that is the mane. Just like in the peacocks, the brighter the feathers, the healthier he is. But there's a third argument that's somewhat interesting, and that is that the flashy male, by the very ability to take predators away, by making themselves vulnerable to predators and still being there, they must be pretty tough, right? They're making themselves obvious, they're drawing the predators away, but they're still surviving. Somehow they're getting away, so they must have pretty good genes. And so the mechanisms are self-perpetuating in a sense, but mate choice has driven some of these traits to pretty extreme points, like the peacock or some other birds that have not only very colorful plumages, but very elaborate behaviors that are selected for by the females differentially. When I point this up, just think about this, because this is more speculation, but do we have sexual selection within our own species? What would be the traits that a female might preferentially choose or look for, not today, not right now, but in our evolutionary past? I mean, if we think, what's that?
I said, hopefully it's not being flashy like a peacock.
Being flashy in what way, though? Being flashy is in being brazen or, courageous, risk taker?
I think kind of same thing like a peacock, I think, and if you think about back in the older times, when we had to work the land and grow our own food and do those things,
right?
The guys who were, who were bigger and stronger were usually
sure.
able to kind of do the work that needs to be done.
Could probably provide better. Yeah. Now, intelligence too. If you go back even farther to hunters and gatherers, it might be intelligence that would be attractive because you could find more or catch things in more creative ways or something, or some combination. But I guess where I'm sort of getting at is somehow maybe risky behavior in itself could be something that, who knows, might be something to look at. Yes.
All money.
Money?
All money.
That's why I said don't think about today.
Yeah, now.
But yeah, back in the time it was who had the most berries or who had who could catch more game. And so obviously that's the money aspect of things. All right, let's look at two different ways that new species can arise. This is a process called speciation. There's two general patterns, and we'll look at mechanisms for both of these in a minute. But primarily, you can have a slow accumulation of change over time that can lead to a new species. I'm going to talk about ring species in a little bit, and it'll be a good example of this. There's another example. It's not a ring species, but there's populations of frogs. Now, we're going to sort of butt heads on a problem here, and that is, how do we define different species? Why do we say this is a different species from this? And we generally say that if you can interbreed and produce offspring, you're the same species. That's our simplest definition. Well, there are populations of frogs, for instance, in Texas and Oklahoma and South and North Dakota and Canada. And the Texas frogs can breed with the Oklahoma frogs. And the Oklahoma frogs can breed with the South Dakota frogs, the South Dakota with the North Dakota, and the North Dakota with Canada. But if you take a frog from Texas to Canada, they can't interbreed. They're different species. Where did that happen? Right? It didn't. There's no point where we can draw a line and say, okay, here's where that happened. But by the isolation, over enough time, the two populations became distinct enough. That's the kind of thing you see with anagenesis. Okay, you're going to see slow accumulations of change over time, and eventually, if the original population becomes isolated from the other populations, they can evolve into new species. We also have cladogenesis, and this can occur within a population even, or within a region in which there are different resources that can be taken advantage of from an original population then can branch off in different directions. This is what Darwin saw in the Galapagos Islands quite a bit with the finches. Even within a certain finch population, there are finches with small beaks and big beaks because they're feeding on different seeds in that area. So all of these different types of mechanisms for isolation can lead to speciation. Here are those finches, for instance. And like I said, most of these were island to island, but even on single islands there were finches with different characteristics feeding on different things and preferentially breeding with others feeding on, so isolating themselves even within a larger population. We sort of went through a series of that, and now we're starting to reverse that and go back to less isolation, so healthy genetically for our species. Habitat isolation, behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, mechanical. We'll focus mostly on mechanical as our best example, but any of these mechanisms for isolating populations into separate breeding populations can lead to selection. Because if you have an isolated breeding population, any changes due to mutation or adaptation, will accumulate to the point where that population can no longer breed with the previous or the parental generation. So these two patterns that I mentioned, one being within a population or within a region without mechanical separation, these are either behavioral or habitat separation, that's called sympatric speciation. The more, I think a little bit easier to see is the allopatric speciation, that it can occur with physical separation, mechanical separation. And the example that I've shown here is, say you have a valley, this might be central Texas, and you have a species of flower or plant that can grow throughout that valley. Texas has been flooded by epicontinental seas on 3 occasions. Perhaps one of those occasions that created an epicontinental sea in central Texas isolated these flowers on either side of that ocean, and one side became more arid while another side remained more humid. Changes in those populations over time accumulated. When the sea retreated millions of years later, they could then move back into the valley and come in contact, but they're now new species. Now again, it's real easy to, I think it's an easier pattern to see, partly because of the time involved here. How long does it take for sympatric speciation? It can take different lengths of time. It might generally a less obvious process along the way, but it can happen. That's more or less what we're seeing with the frogs. Here's another example that I always like to bring up. This is one of many ring species. This is particularly common around the Arctic Circle with birds, populations, and so on, but it's populations that in this case, these salamanders migrated historically from an original population at the top around the Baja Peninsula. And if you look at any adjacent population, if you start with the one at the top and you have to go around clockwise, those two populations can interbreed. These two can interbreed. These two can also interbreed, as can these, and so can these and these. But these cannot interbreed with these. Even though they're adjacent populations now, this is sort of like taking that series of frogs and actually bringing it back together. But by the time they migrated this far, they're genetically too distinct to breed with the original population. So we would, by the definition I gave you before of how to define a species, we would have to call them different species. But there's no point at which we can draw that line until we get all the way back around. So it does bring into question, what does species mean? It's again, a convenient designation that we give animals to help us understand them. And when we look at it in a phylogenetic sense over long periods of time, it seems to be pretty easy. When we look at things right now, it can be more difficult than that. So these ring species, again, are examples of a number of things. The island chains that Darwin looked at, we can look at these in many different ways, as well as similar to the frog populations migrating across distances. So any mechanism of isolation can lead to speciation. Migration, mechanical barriers, behavioral barriers, and so on. One thing that should be obvious, actually, this is no longer really a controversy as it was for a while, but geologists even from the beginning were arguing about whether or not change happened gradually or catastrophically. In other words, nothing really happened unless there was a catastrophe, and then things changed quite a bit, and they were stable then until there was another big catastrophe. And it's a little bit of both. Within periods of stable time between major catastrophes, there is evolution happening, and quite a bit can happen due to gene selection and these other processes that we're talking about. But catastrophic change does happen every once in a while, and it punctuates this otherwise gradual change with these rapid radiations that occur after extinction events. So we have both gradualism and catastrophism occurring through what's now called punctuated equilibrium, and this really was Stephen Gould's major contribution to our way of thinking. Statistically, if you look at it over long periods of time, it's the catastrophes that drive most of the change. But within any of these periods of time, like we are today, since the end of the Cretaceous, it's gradual changes over time. That's what's led to whales from bears, right? or bear-like animals, or really bears. Seals from dog-like animals, and so on. Those are pretty dramatic changes that have happened gradually over time. Now, if we had another asteroid impact, or if we're causing a major mass extinction event right now, we might eliminate much of our current diversity, and then there would be new opportunities for what survives to diversify more rapidly. Because the niche space is open, there's less competition, there's more isolation. Okay, I'm going to go through the last couple slides fairly quickly to get to the quiz here. These are just, again, some of the interesting patterns that I'd like to bring up. What I'm trying to point out with this slide is something fairly, well, I don't know if it's obvious or subtle, but if you have a mutation in a normal, what's called somatic cell, a cell of your body, muscle cell, brain cell, bone, that's probably going to cause cancer or nothing, right? It's either going to be benign, no big deal. It's not going to be passed on to your offspring. But if you have a mutation in your sperm or egg, that will be passed on to your offspring. So mutations that occur within gametes, sperm and eggs, can have much greater influences than mutations that occur in a somatic cell. One of those patterns is what's called heterochrony, and there are aspects within heterochrony, such as neoteny, that is interesting in our own species. One of the most interesting mutations that has been seen to happen is sort of a timing gene. In other words, as you develop as an embryo, there are genes that control when certain things develop and when that stops. You stopped growing at some point, right? There's a gene that told your cells when to stop. Well, if the timing of that changes, then the ratio of our heads to our body can be changed. And that's what's happened in our own history. Our heads are bigger relative to our bodies than most other species. It causes a lot of problems with the birth process, but it does also allow for a larger cerebellum or cerebrum, which gives us more intelligence. That's an adolescent trait. Look at your kids, right? Their heads are bigger relative to their bodies than yours are. So a gene that can stop growth earlier maintains that larger ratio of head to body ratio, and can allow for more intelligence. So that's an example of heterochrony. We can see those examples in other places. The zebra stripes is another example of that, which occurred due to the change in a developmental gene. Now again, as I mentioned before, mutations are rare, so this doesn't happen often. You're not going to get super intelligence all of a sudden from one of these kinds of genes. But it does sort of add something to the mix for adaptation, for natural selection to work on. So they're interesting. The last thing, and this ties together with some of our own history, when we talk about the out of Africa hypothesis, for instance, we based a lot of that on what's called mitochondrial DNA, or a genetic clock. Mutations do occur over long periods of time at a fairly regular pace. Again, most of these are bad. They get selected away out of the population, lead to birth defects, or even the embryo doesn't develop at all past a few cells. Most of the time we're not even aware of that. So most mutations have that fate. But we also have genes in our mitochondria of our cells, and these are not selected for or against. They're just passed on from mother to children. All of our mitochondria come from our mothers because they're passed on through the egg, not the sperm. Sperm doesn't carry mitochondria, doesn't live long enough to need extra energy. So you get all your mitochondrial DNA from your mother. Any mutations that have happened are going to be recorded in that DNA. And so if populations that are together and are mixing their mitochondrial DNA become isolated, those mutations begin to accumulate in different directions, and you can use them to go back and say, this is when they were all together, this is when they split apart. And when we do that with human populations, they all lead back to Africa, which is why we call that mitochondrial Eve, the population, not the single person, but the population that carried that original mitochondrial DNA. that has since diversified, or diverged, as we moved apart and became isolated. So those are some interesting patterns. Cladistics is the topic of this week's lab. We'll talk more about that, and we have more or less looked at our own history. I just described how the out of Africa hypothesis was started with studies of mitochondrial DNA, but there's a lot more to it. We talked a little bit about that earlier. All right, let me go to the book for the quiz. I added a lab, and I want to talk about that if we do the quiz, so don't leave right away. Or actually, let me do that now. I added a lab, bioethics lab. It will be available next week. It'll be available on the 7th at 10 o'clock, and it'll be available for a week. That's 10 p.m., not a.m., that's a.m., and that's p.m. So you'll be able to click on this next week. There's an assignment in there that asks you to go follow a link to a page that the National Institute of Health has put together about ethics, bioethics. And from there, after you've read a little bit, find something new on YouTube or wherever, an article or a video, something new that hasn't been discussed, that we haven't, that's, new to you, for one thing. If you can find something new to me, that's great, I'll give you extra credit. Because I do this every semester and I keep track of this pretty close, but every once in a while I'm surprised. But find something that you'd never heard of before and send me the link. Send it to my email, hoagb@uhd.edu. I'm going to pick one and put it in the discussion board. It's not there yet because I don't have it, right? But when I do, when I get everybody's contribution, I will put it in the discussion board, and then I want everybody to comment on it. Now, if you have Monday's lab, you might get slightly different instructions, but it's going to be similar. We've talked about it a little bit, and so we may even use the exact same lab. I don't know. But that's just for next week. I'm not going to be here Tuesday. You don't need to come to lab on Tuesday, or don't need to come here even lecture. No lecture Tuesday. And the lab will be online, so we won't be coming to lab either next week. So, yay, next week. And guess what? People who aren't here today, they're going to show up next Tuesday morning, and they're going to go, "Where's everybody?" Or they won't show up because they're not showing up anyway yet. All right, so we did the quiz in the middle of the chapter. Now we're looking for the quiz at the end of the chapter, which should be here. So, true or false? Natural selection is only one mechanism for evolution. That's true. It's the primary mechanism. 90-some% of evolution is due to natural selection, but mutations account for some. We talked about genetic drift. That can actually account for some, but due to adaptive landscapes that can separate populations by behavior and other things, so that sympatric evolution can occur simply because of genetic drift on occasion. But natural selection is the primary mechanism. But it's true that it is only one mechanism. All right. Number 2, acquired characteristics can be passed on to offspring. If you remember Tuesday's lecture, that's false. I cannot acquire a trait during my lifetime and pass it on to my children. No matter how much I practice, right? I can become the best soccer player I want to be. My kids are going to have to learn on their own. Yes?
What if there could be any possibility that genetic trait actually put in you when you're alive?
Now, we can do that. We could do that now, potentially. We're going to be talking about neo-evolution pretty soon. It's one of those ethical things you might run across. And it is the idea that we can genetically alter ourselves now. Do we want to do that? Do we want to give our kids more intelligence, more creativity, more athletic ability? If you could do that for your child, would you? The ethical side of that is not only the obvious one when we think about, quote, playing God, But it's what happens economically, the people who can afford to do that and the people who can't. That's like, H.G. Wells stuff there. All right, so if you've read H.G. Wells' Time Machine, in the future, there are the monstrous humans that turned out to have been us, and then there was a whole new race when he went in the future that had made themselves better. And this was before we had modern genetics. It's amazing how sometimes science fiction can do that. So, acquired traits cannot. So this is false. Cladistics is a tool for testing hypotheses about the fossil record. If you were in lab on Tuesday, you know that that's true. If you come to lab today, I'll show you how cladistics can be used to form hypotheses about the fossil record. All right, this is one of those controversial ones. I talked about this before, I think, but less today. Humans and apes share a common ancestor.
True.
That's true. Now let me be real clear here. We share a common ancestor. That ancestor was not an ape or a human. Okay, so we haven't evolved from apes. We have a common ancestor with the apes. Our most recent, and with monkeys, yes. We can trace that as far back as we want. The most recent common ancestor would have had human and ape-like characteristics, which diverged in different directions. Prior to that, monkeys. Prior to that, they're prosimians that were around when the dinosaurs were running around. Not quite to the extent that the movie Dinosaur had the little lemurs running around, but anyway, somewhat like that. Yes?
What is the earliest record of caveman?
Well, generally speaking, if you go back to Australopithecines and some of the early human ancestors, you're talking 4 or 5 million years, 6 at the absolute oldest, with the fossils have human characteristics. Now keep in mind, those gradual changes we were talking about, where we draw the line is not always as obvious as we'd like it to be. So about 5 to 6 is again, fossils of organisms that had human-like characteristics, or teeth and different things that we use to look at that. The common ancestor we're talking about was about 8 million years ago. So that's the time frame on that. So we do share a common ancestor. Evolution is random? False. Absolutely nothing random about it. Now again, don't confuse the term chance with random. A chance event is one that has low odds, but it's not random. There is a causal relationship there. All right. I'm always afraid to check if I clicked something wrong. No, I got it all right this time. All right, and again, if you make a mistake with these, send me an email. I'll keep a note of it, take it into account at the end. But all right, I will see everyone next Thursday. That's not coming to lab at 10 o'clock. I'll see you guys in half an hour or so.